This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, September 20th, 1664. First off, it's the 1600s. It's been a while. We don't go back that far enough on this show, so it's nice to be there in the 1600s, though tough topic. But here we are in 1664, and on this date, Maryland passed the First Anti-Amalgamation Law. This was a law intended to prevent marriages between black men and English women. But of course, in this time, as in all times, people from all sorts of backgrounds were falling in love and marrying and having children. In colonial Jamestown, there were white-black children, black and Indian marriages, white and Indian families. Cut to 100 years after this law that we're discussing, by the time of the American Revolution, some estimates say there were 60,000, maybe as many as 120,000 people of, quote, mixed heritage residing in the colonies. But in 1664, Maryland did pass this first anti-amalgamation law, and these types of laws were on the books for, well, we'll talk about it, but way, way too long. Many anti-miscegenation laws weren't repealed until the 60s, the 1960s.
The 1960s.
Yep. Alabama had a law on the books until the year 2000. But anyway, let's stay in colonial times for now. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So before we get into this law, listeners may have noticed, and I certainly noticed, that this is called an anti-amalgamation law, and obviously in more modern times, we've called this anti-miscegenation. I went down a little rabbit hole about the distinction between the two. I mean, Kellie, do you have thoughts on those two words, amalgamation versus miscegenation? I kind of have.
It's funny. I've always used them interchangeably because they've always meant the same thing, which is just basically interracial marriage for our 21st century context. Right. It would be all interracial marriages.
But I think that there's an interesting difference. I mean, amalgamation is a word that you would use in a lot of different situations, right? Amalgamation just means to mix together a few different things. But miscegenation has that gene coding in it.
Yes,
and that, to me, speaks to kind of the scientific racism behind all of this.
Totally. Mm-hmm. And that is,
I would agree.
And that is largely tracks with the kind of usage of these words. So in this time, they were called anti-amalgamation. And then anti-miscegenation was a word and a phrase that was really, it was invented and coined basically to argue against this practice in the run-up to the Civil War. And I agree, like amalgamation sort of has these implications of melting pot and you're making something new, whereas miscegenation is only seen in the sort of negative context, even though...
Mm-hmm. And it times perfectly well with like race science. Like during this time, a lot of medical schools are coming up with terms and ideas to really protect their racist ideas. So if they can back it up with something genetic, they can make these laws have more legitimacy.
Right. Though in this colonial moment, 1664 in Maryland, I mean, let's paint the picture of why this is a pressing concern, how this connects to the larger empire and colonial project. But what do we need to know about Maryland in 1664?
I mean, part of this comes from the idea of mama's baby, daddy's maybe, right? So like and part of that is because a lot of these laws that you'll start to see, especially in the 1600s, come out, they codify slavery in a way that made slavery a permanent life circumstance, so that you were born into slavery. If your mother was a slave, you were a slave, and there was sort of no discussion about it. But these laws become tricky when you start to have enslaved men have relationships with white indentured women, and those white indentured women are free. And so because their mother is free, these black or interracial children are also free. And this posed a huge problem to the structure because it was meant to be based on very, pun intended, but black and white terms in terms of who was a slave and who was free. And so by creating laws that outlawed these relationships, it was meant to halt or stop free black people from growing and from their populations from growing.
And just to add a little more context to this, I mean, in these early years in the 17th century, there were all sorts of levels of unfreedom in the U.S.
Yeah.
There was enslavement that lasted for a lifetime. There was indentured servitude, which would last for maybe 7 to 10 years. And then there was kind of heritable enslavement, which is developing in the 17th century, the idea that your condition of free or enslaved passed down through the mother. And at the same time, this becomes racialized, right? That as indentured servitude for white people goes away, enslavement for Black people becomes heritable, becomes like a condition that's tied to race. And that's when these miscegenation laws become really, really important, because they're policing the lines of race and freedom in a way that gets encoded into law. And so these anti-amalgamation laws are really important for defining racial citizenship in the United States.
And preventing confusion, right? Because if you're Black, you're a slave. If you're a slave, you're Black.
Yeah.
And if you're marrying and having babies with somebody who is not Black, then all of a sudden it's like, wait a second, we've told everyone that whiteness is one thing and Blackness is one thing. What's amalgamation? Now all of a sudden you're blurring racial categories. And this is why the one drop rule emerges, right? That if you have one drop of Black blood, then you are Black, because you need to police and police and police those racial boundaries.
Yeah, and it gets ridiculous, right? And when I say ridiculous, I mean the sort of racial classifications that they had for people that were half Black, 1/4 Black, 1/8 Black, 1/16 Black. Like, at what point are you white, phenotypically or otherwise? It was really meant to prevent for anyone to be able to sort of claim whiteness, even if they were phenotypically white presenting, because it was meant to perpetuate slavery and those inheritances for people who own slaves.
Yeah.
And if you include Indigenous people in this, then all of a sudden you get like this other racial category, and you get an interesting messiness, because indigeneity is not necessarily tied to freedom or unfreedom. And so the first interracial marriage that is sort of historically recorded in North America is between John Rolfe and Pocahontas. And there becomes such a mythology that builds up around Pocahontas, and kind of if having a drop of Black blood is considered awful, is considered disqualifying, having a drop of Indigenous blood is considered kind of like, I don't know, like noble or like
exotic.
ties you exotic,
Yeah.
exotic without being tied to unfreedom. And so you get, as these racial categories kind of ossify and more of these anti-miscegenation laws get passed, in places like Virginia, you get something called the Pocahontas exception, which is, it's not mixed race if you're like part Indigenous, because that's actually kind of cool.
It's wild.
Yeah.
It's wild.
It's crazy. Yeah.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you, hosting the world together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
I just want to highlight that, not to discount that there wasn't like structural oppression in place, but you also get an overwhelming sense of improvisation in this moment. You know?
Yes.
And in part because I think we're talking about a period when like these communities were very small. They were frontier. They were figuring things out. They had like, you know, by definition had come to a new land to kind of build something new. And so this is one of those inflection points. But like the step forwards were, I think eventually you get kind of the race science and you work backwards from there. But in this moment, you get the sense of like, this thing happened. What do we do with it? Right? These people are falling in love. What do we do with it? I mean, some of these laws were literally about like a lord or a powerful person's daughter fell in love with a Black person. It's like, what do we do? So Lord Baltimore pushes for a law to codify this. But this 1664 moment is really, you know, again, there's actually something being written onto the books, and it is not a coincidence, just to highlight everything you're saying about how these projects about amalgamation and slavery and freedom are connected. It is not a coincidence in this same year, Maryland also passes the first statute that proclaims that all Black people would be enslaved for life. So you've codified the sort of questions of freedom, and then in order to then back up and work in concert with this law about amalgamation.
Yeah, and you kind of hit the nail on the head. I mean, all of this is about power. Like, how do people maintain their power? How do people box out others from power? How do we sort of keep in place structures that will repeat themselves over and over again so that there's no confusion? And by the time you get to the 1700s, that process is sort of complete in terms of how we think about blackness and whiteness has really hardened by the middle of the 18th century.
And that's why this Maryland statute is so interesting, because this Maryland legislation says that, all right, if an English woman, a white woman, marries a black person, marry somebody who's enslaved, then they too will be enslaved and their children will be enslaved. And that, again, to the improvisation idea, was actually a little messy because increasingly, like, white people weren't supposed to be in a state of unfreedom. And so one of the things that you see begin to happen after this statute is that white women who marry black men are expelled from the colony or from the state because it's uncomfortable to have a white person in a state of enslavement, but it's also not acceptable to have them in a situation where they're married to somebody who is enslaved or who is black. And that becomes, you see them kind of negotiating, oh, what do we do? Nobody's comfortable with seeing white women enslaved, but we also can't have them marrying black people. So what do we do?
Yeah, you see a lot of laws in the mid-18th century, certainly early 19th century, where there were pockets of free black communities that now, if you're a free person in a slave state, you have, 30 days to get out of the state, or X amount of days, or risk re-enslavement. And so it wipes out a lot of these communities that had been free for generations, black communities that had been free for generations, because there's no protection for you once slavery really becomes the law of the land.
And not to jump to the end of the story, but this actually comes up in Loving v. Virginia, where the Lovings, when they get married, they're an interracial couple. It's against the law in Virginia. They're not supposed to live in Virginia anymore. They're exiled from Virginia in the 1950s, which is just the power of those laws, and that idea of exile remains so strong.
I want to get to that in a minute, but a couple things about the 1600s, 1700s. First off, I went and looked and kind of to try and get a sense of whether there were anti-amalgamation laws, I guess is what they were being called at the time, in England, and there apparently have never been those laws on the books in Europe. Wow. I think in the 5th century there was a rule against Goths marrying someone, but basically largely like in Europe, these laws, these norms and social mores get enforced in many other ways, but there were not laws there. And so it just strikes me as interesting that, the colonial project would sort of take these stances in the colonies and not at home. And it probably raises all sorts of questions about the sort of moral underpinning of all of this.
It also makes sense that when you think about it in terms of England, white people are a majority. And so if you were black in England, you were an exception. Whereas if you were in South Carolina, you were the majority. And so being able to maintain those power lines, not along population, but really along, slave versus free is how these things get.
And I guess that underscores just the kind of it's the practical on the ground reality that forces the kind of the laws to be codified in this way. And, Maryland's laws get stricter and stricter as the years go by. In 1715 and 1717, Maryland passes a law that any white person and a person of African descent can't even cohabitate together. Other states pass this. Let's jump forward, into the 20th century. I guess we can jump forward to the 19th century because we do have this brief moment in Reconstruction where a lot of these laws come off the books and then they go back on the books. Do you have thoughts about that process? I mean, we could do a whole episode on that process. Can I
just say, people don't know this, or maybe it's not popular memory, but one of the most famous, I think, interracial marriages is Frederick Douglass and his second wife, Helen Pitts, who's a white woman, and they married in Washington, D.C. And I don't think people talk about the fact that, throughout the latter 20 years of Douglass's life, he has a white wife. Like, she's Irish, and there are people that hate it and people that support it. They see it as a sign of progress, and other people that see it as a sign of, aggression or Douglas turning his back on his people. But like, the fact that even Douglas was struggling with something like this in the end of the 19th century is wild too.
I also think it speaks to one of the reasons why people are so drawn to thinking about Reconstruction these days is because against the backdrop of this very Whiggish progressive history idea of history, that it's always getting better, Reconstruction stands out as that moment where things got better and then they got a lot worse. Yeah. And I think that this sort of suspension of anti-miscegenation laws, which would then go back on the books and last in some cases until the 1960s, in some cases to 2000, that idea that you would have this moment when people were like, oh, that's no good. We shouldn't have anti-miscegenation laws. Those are bad. And that they would be put back with such force. I mean, there were attempts to get anti-miscegenation laws written into the Constitution of the United States. Yeah. That happens in the late 19th and well into the 19-teens, 1920s. And that kind of small d democratic backsliding, I think people are really interested in for some reason today.
Yeah. But it also doesn't take into account when someone who is Latino marries someone who's Asian, or someone who's Indian marries someone who's white. These are very black and white laws. There's not a lot of consideration for other races.
Although there are anti-miscegenation laws on the books in the West that are
in California,
between white people can't marry people of Asian descent or people of Latino descent. So even though I think the core of it is very much white and black, especially because of that Pocahontas exception that we talked about, there are these other laws that are proliferating in the West that get a little less attention.
All right. Well, we're going to wrap up. I will say one thing about that 2000 Alabama law coming off the books. Sometimes when you hear these stories about a law was on the books and they got around to doing it way too late, you're like, oh, maybe it was this obscurely worded law or this thing that was could be interpreted. I just want to read you what was on the books in Alabama in the state constitution, section 102, which is, I think, just by number alone, feels like a pretty important section of the Constitution. Section 102 read, "The legislature shall never pass any law to authorize or legalize any marriage between any white person and a Negro or descendant of a Negro." That was on the books until the year 2000. I don't think there was anyone who could claim that it snuck through. We didn't really know what it was about. But yeah.
Not great.
Crazy to me. Wait, can I say a fun fact? Did you know that on Finding Your Roots, the PBS show that Henry Louis Gates does, he traced the ancestry of the comedian Wanda Sykes and found that her family had actually never been enslaved because her first ancestor from the 1600s was a white woman who was an indentured servant who had children with a black man. And so her whole family line is actually not descendant of slaves, but of free people, free black people. Yeah. Wow. Which is wild, too.
I haven't seen that episode, but I bet you it's fun. I like Wanda Sykes. All right. We will leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is the only software your business will ever need. Featuring a suite of integrated business applications, Odoo connects your business operations together so you can get more done in less time. Odoo has apps for everything: CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, marketing, manufacturing, you name it, Odoo's got it. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday.
Radiotopia.